Judge Andrew Napolitano thought he could silence Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett by imposing a $1,000 contempt fine during her testimony. At 75 years old, the former conservative legal analyst for Fox News and current federal judge looked at Jasmine with complete confidence in his power, but he had no idea what would happen next. "You're out of order, Congresswoman," Napolitano declared, his voice echoing through the packed courthouse. "I'm fining you $1,000 for contempt of this court." The room went dead silent. Crockett, a former civil rights attorney, turned slowly and stood up. What she said next didn't just shock everyone in that courtroom. It may have ended Andrew Napolitano's judicial career forever. But before diving into the story, hit that like button and stay with us. What happens next is worth every second of your time. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with tension that morning. Just weeks prior, multiple states had enacted new voting laws that civil rights advocates labeled as the harshest attempts at voter suppression since the days of Jim Crow. What was meant to be a platform for expert insights during congressional hearings had quickly turned into a fierce political battleground. For years, Andrew Napolitano had been Fox News' go-to legal analyst, explaining constitutional law to millions of viewers with his stern demeanor. His nightly appearances made him a household name among conservatives who valued his devotion to constitutional principles. When Trump appointed him to the federal bench, it seemed like the perfect capstone to a career built on conservative legal philosophy. The confirmation hearing had been surprisingly smooth, with even some Democratic senators praising his legal knowledge. His colleagues described him as meticulous and utterly convinced of his own legal brilliance. The hearing that brought them together was about the Protecting Voting Rights Act, legislation that would restore key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court had gutted. Crockett had been invited to testify about voter suppression in Texas, bringing with her a binder full of evidence that Republican legislators were systematically making it harder for people of color to vote. For Andrew Napolitano, this was supposed to be a routine hearing: ask some questions, maintain order, maybe make a few pointed comments about federal overreach. The hearing started exactly as Napolitano expected. He sat behind his massive wooden bench, looking down at the witness table where Crockett sat with her thick binder. "Congresswoman Crockett," Napolitano began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he perfected over decades. "You've made some very serious allegations about voting restrictions in Texas. I hope you have substantial evidence to back up these claims." Crockett looked up at him, her expression calm but focused. "Your Honor, I have extensive documentation of systematic voter suppression affecting over 200,000 voters in my district alone. I'll be the judge of what constitutes evidence in my courtroom," Napolitano replied, a slight edge creeping into his voice. "Please stick to facts, not political rhetoric." The first warning sign flashed across Crockett's face, but she kept her composure, opening her binder with deliberate precision. "Of course, Your Honor. Let me start with documented cases of polling locations being closed without proper notice, disproportionately affecting communities of color." As Crockett began presenting her evidence, something unexpected started happening. Her testimony wasn't the typical political grandstanding Napolitano was used to hearing. This was a former civil rights attorney methodically building a case, citing specific statutes, and presenting evidence with surgical precision. "In Harris County alone," Crockett continued, "we documented 47 polling locations that were closed between 2020 and 2024, with 87% of those closures occurring in zip codes with majority-minority populations." Congresswoman Napolitano interrupted, "Correlation is not causation. You can't simply assume." "I'm not assuming anything, Your Honor." Crockett cut him off smoothly. "I'm presenting statistical analysis that shows a clear pattern of discriminatory intent backed by internal communications from state election officials that we obtained through FOIA requests." The tension in the room was palpable. Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Democratic members leaned forward, sensing something significant was building. Andrew Napolitano's jaw tightened. In his courtroom experience, witnesses, especially political witnesses, didn't usually come this prepared. Furthermore, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, "We have documented evidence that these closures were coordinated through a systematic plan developed by—" "That's enough," Napolitano's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Congresswoman, you're turning my courtroom into a political rally." I asked for facts, not conspiracy theories. The room went electric. Crockett slowly closed her binder, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she looked up at Napolitano, there was fire in her eyes. Your Honor, with all due respect, everything I have presented is documented fact. If you're uncomfortable with the truth, that says more about your judicial philosophy than my testimony. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Nobody talked to Judge Andrew Napolitano like that. The media section erupted in furious note-taking. Napolitano's face flushed red. This young congresswoman had just questioned his judicial philosophy in front of a packed courtroom and live television cameras. Congresswoman Crockett. His voice was ice-cold now. You seem to have forgotten where you are. This is a federal courtroom, not the House floor. I will not tolerate your disrespectful tone. Crockett stood up slowly. Your Honor, I've been nothing but respectful. I presented evidence in a clear, logical manner. If you find facts disrespectful, perhaps we need to examine why that is. The room was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting to see what would happen next. I'm going to ask you one more time. Napolitano's voice was shaking with barely controlled anger to limit your testimony to factual evidence without editorial commentary. Everything I've said has been factual evidence, Crockett replied, her voice steady. Internal emails showing coordination between state officials to close polling sites in minority communities. That's fact. The statistical analysis showing discriminatory impact. That's fact. The sworn testimony from voters who were disenfranchised. And that's fact. Which of these facts would you like me to stop presenting? That's when Andrew Napolitano made the mistake that would define this entire confrontation. Instead of recognizing that he was facing a legal mind as sharp as his own, he fell back on the one thing he thought would silence her, the absolute power of his position. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, raising his gavel. You are out of order. I'm holding you in contempt and fining you $1,000. The sound of the gavel striking the bench rang out sharply, breaking the stillness of the courtroom. For a brief moment, everyone stood frozen. A federal judge had just declared a sitting congresswoman in contempt for sharing evidence of voting rights abuses. But then something remarkable occurred. Rather than retreating, Crockett flashed a confident smile. The moment Judge Andrew Napolitano brought down that gavel, the entire dynamic in the courtroom shifted. What he thought would be the end of Jasmine Crockett's disruptive testimony had actually just become the beginning of his worst nightmare. Your Honor, Crockett began, her voice now carrying a different quality, still respectful, but with an underlying steel that made everyone lean forward. I accept your contempt citation. But before we proceed, I have a few questions about the legal basis for this ruling. Andrew Napolitano's eyebrows shot up. Congresswoman, you don't get to question my legal rulings in my own courtroom. Actually, Your Honor, I do. Crockett's voice was calm and measured. As a member of Congress with constitutional immunity under the speech or debate clause, and as a licensed attorney in good standing, I have both the right and the obligation to question any ruling that appears to violate constitutional principles. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Republican committee members started frantically texting their legal teams. Democratic members sat forward in their chairs, realizing they were about to witness something historic. The Speech or Debate Clause, Article 1, Section 6 of the Constitution, protects members of Congress from being questioned about their legislative speech in any other place. My testimony here today about voting rights legislation currently before Congress falls squarely within that protection. Your contempt citation, therefore, appears to be a direct violation of the constitutional separation of powers. Andrew Napolitano stared down at Crockett, his legal mind racing through the implications of what she just said. She wasn't just some politician playing lawyer. She was demonstrating a command of constitutional law that rivaled his own. However, Your Honor, there's something else we need to discuss. She opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Before issuing your contempt citation, did you consider your own statements about voting rights legislation? I'm talking about your appearance on Fox News 3 weeks ago where you stated, and I quote, "The Protecting Voting Rights Act is constitutional overreach that will destroy the integrity of American elections." Did you make that statement? The courtroom exploded. Republican committee members looked shocked. Democratic members were furious. The media section went into overdrive. My previous commentary as a private citizen has no bearing on my judicial duties. Napolitano stammered. Doesn't it? Crockett's voice was razor-sharp. According to the Judicial Code of Conduct, Canon 2 specifically requires judges to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Publicly condemning legislation and then holding a congresswoman in contempt for defending that same legislation seems to create exactly that appearance. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the next blow. In fact, Your Honor, weren't you specifically warned by judicial ethics experts that your media appearances might create conflicts of interest when you were confirmed to this position? But the constitutional arguments were just the opening act. What came next would destroy Andrew Napolitano's credibility forever. Your Honor, there's one more thing. Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a tablet. Are you familiar with the law firm Brennan & Associates? Andrew Napolitano's eyes went wide for the first time in the entire proceeding. Congresswoman, I don't see how that's relevant. It's relevant because Brennan & Associates has been paid $2.3 million over the past 2 years by the Republican National Committee to challenge voting rights legislation in federal court. And according to financial disclosure forms, you own significant stock in Brennan & Associates. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Republicans jumped to their feet shouting objections. Democrats demanded answers. The media section was in a complete frenzy. That's a lie, Napolitano shouted, his composure completely shattered. Crockett held up the tablet showing financial documents. These are your financial disclosure forms from last year filed with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Line 47 shows your investment in Brennan & Associates. Should I read the exact amount? It's $847,000 in stock holdings, Your Honor. Nearly $1 million invested in a firm whose primary revenue stream depends on blocking the very legislation I'm here to support. The silence that followed was crushing. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself against a contempt citation. She had systematically destroyed Judge Andrew Napolitano's credibility, his integrity, and possibly his entire judicial career. Your Honor, I move that you recuse yourself from any further proceedings related to voting rights legislation due to your clear conflict of interest. I also move that my contempt citation be dismissed as constitutionally invalid and ethically compromised. The judge, who had started this hearing with complete confidence, now sat in stunned silence as his career crumbled around him. Court is in recess, Andrew Napolitano mumbled, practically fleeing from the bench as he disappeared through the door behind it. The courtroom erupted in chaos. But through it all, Jasmine Crockett stood at the witness table, calm and composed, having just delivered one of the most devastating legal takedowns in modern political history. The political fallout was swift and severe. Just hours later, Democrats were demanding Andrew Napolitano's impeachment. Progressive groups, which had been gearing up for regular campaigns focused on voting rights, suddenly discovered they had a powerful symbol of judicial corruption right in front of them. The White House found itself in the awkward position of commenting on a federal judge appointed by the previous administration. The Judicial Ethics Committee announced they would expedite their review of any complaints against Napolitano. What the public didn't see was the frantic activity happening behind the scenes. Congressional investigators were already pulling Napolitano's financial records. The FBI was beginning a preliminary investigation into potential judicial corruption. Crockett's challenge to Napolitano revealed the whole web of financial interests trying to weaken voting rights. It clearly demonstrated to Americans how money moves within the system to sway court rulings. Even more crucially, it proved that these systems can be challenged. A well-prepared and informed advocate can shine a light on corruption and make even the most influential figures answerable for their actions. Jasmine didn't just make Judge Andrew Napolitano think twice about his contempt citation. She showcased what true leadership means in today's world. What do you think about this situation? We want to hear your thoughts. Please share your opinion in the comments below. If this story